what's going on? It's your girl T.I.E here, which stands for Together Individual Entertainment. Okay, so I know it's been a while. I'm sorry about that, but when you're working and you have so much going on, you just lose track of time and everything. But still, I'm going to get into Chapter 4 of Book 1, Gilded Rose by Emma Ham. And basically, like I said, this is the retelling of Beauty and the Beast. There's also 2 more books that I'm going to do a 5-chapter preview with. Book 2 is Emerald Rose, and Book 3 is Midnight Rose. If you want to read these books yourself, you can purchase them along with the audio on Amazon. So, I realized my videos didn't really have enough sound in the background for the fantasy music to come in. So I'm going to try something a little different this time. I'm going to try YouTube on my television, which is separate because most TVs do have that. They have YouTube on their television these days. But basically, that's what I'm going to try. So let me just find Chapter 4 here. Oh, and skip the page. There we go. And let's get into Chapter 4 of a 5-chapter preview of Gilded Rose. All right, here we go. So I'm going to play here. Something cold touched the tip of Amisha's nose. Once, twice, 3 times. She wanted to continue sleeping on her side and go back into happy dreams. The tiniest of brushes made her snort, then open her eyes. The fire was nothing more than a weak smolder. Her father must not be working on a project this morning. If he had remembered the fire, then maybe he had remembered breakfast as well. Her stomach growled. She pushed herself up onto the elbow and stared down between her hands. The ground was crystallized and with frost. The ground, all the memories, and rushed back through her, striking over and over like a sledgehammer, breaking through precious stone. And the dread, they had attacked her home. She had been the one to destroy everything. And then, "Father," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Once more, "Father, what have I done? What did you make me do?" She pushed herself up, stumbling onto her feet and staring at the forest, now flooded with light. A faint dusting of snow covered everything but the circle of flame as far as her eye could see. The first snow had always been her favorite. The way it danced down from the sky made her laugh with glee. Her father used to place her on his knee when she was little, and it snowed. He'd point at every single snowflake and say each one was unique, special. Amisha lifted a hand and caught a few of them on her palm. They melted, but they were coming down thicker and thicker. This wasn't just the first snow, but a storm that threatened to cover the entire forest in a blanket. She wouldn't be able to survive. She had to find shelter. The trees wouldn't keep her safe from the snow, but she also didn't want to leave her circle of safety just yet. This land was foreign. Amisha hadn't even seen maps of this area before. There never had been a reason for her to leave the safety of Little Marsh. What had her father been thinking, sending her out into the wilds on her own with no training on how to stay safe? Didn't seem the smartest task he'd ever given her. But that wasn't fair. He wanted her to live. He had faith that if something like this was to happen, she would know how to take care of herself. That she would continue to survive. Because he and all the people of Little Marsh hadn't. "You can't stay here forever," she muttered. "Find a way," she decided. The only way to find shelter was to continue forward. She couldn't go back to Little Marsh. The Dread were probably still swarming the place, looking for survivors, which meant she had to continue through the forest. The mere thought made her knees weak. The Dread were already here. She'd seen them last night. Somehow, she was certain they would attack once her fire was out. So, she wouldn't have to take the fire with her. Amisha bent down and grabbed a large branch. She tore a small strip of fabric off the bottom of her skirt and wrapped it around the end. That would burn for longer than just a plain stick. She have to keep running. She had to keep ruining her apron as well, but she darned thing was already mud splattered. She trudged through the forest, branching her makeshift torch. High above her head, let the dread come to her if they dared. She would fight them, as she had before. The creatures were not as nimble as she. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the earth in a thin layer of shimmering ice. Her books kept her feet warm, and she was grateful for the socks preventing frostbite from eating her toes. She shivered, wrapped her arms around herself. She would have given anything for a shawl, even just a scrap of fabric to wrap around her arms and shoulders. The pine trees grew laden with snow, their branches bowing down and touching the ground. The snow deepened soon. Amisha was trudging through snow halfway up to her knees. I will endure this, the words echoed in her mind, forcing her to move forward. She could survive. She would survive. For what other choice did she have? The cold bit through her clothing. Her breath fogged in front of her face, and she couldn't quite feel her fingers any longer. She tried very hard not to think about what that meant, but it wasn't good. People died very fast in the cold. She peered through the snow, an icy storm, a hut, that's all she wanted to find. Something, anything, to give her a little shelter. She couldn't even build a fire, and with all the twigs and branches wet and cold, a thin layer of ice covered everything, warmth disappearing from the world as if by magic. The storm stilled for a heartbeat of the time. Amisha stared forward at a chateau, stretching as far as her eyes could see, a great monolith of a building, stunning and splendorous. In sudden clarity, this place must have once been a sight to behold. She could hardly fathom the sheer size of it, as it seemed to go on for miles. A lake surrounded the chateau. Through the waters were now frozen. Great pillars stretched up from the corners of the building, high up to many stories. From the windows she counted at least 3 levels where people might have lived. Gold and silver gilded the entire building. Gardens stretched in a maze around the sides, and she wondered if they went all the way behind the chateau. What is this place? She whispered. The words and the wind took them from her lips, pulling them away and dashing them toward the chateau, as though the castle might answer her questions itself. If someone so grand had lived near the marsh, wouldn't she have heard of it? Surely the villagers would have spoken of the great lord or prince who lived away, very far away in the woods. She didn't have time to ponder what strange anomaly had brought her to this place. It was serendipity, and she was saved. The servants wouldn't turn her away from the warmth fire and perhaps a few bites of bread before they sent her on her way. The storm picked up again, but she knew where to walk now. Putting one foot in front of the other, she forced her body to continue moving. Her knees shook, wanting to collapse with the weight of the exhaustion and cold. Her shoulders ached from keeping her body straight, and her heart thundered in the chest. Amisha touched a foot to ice and paused when the entire lake heaved and gurgled protest. The ice was only recently frozen, though it had been a cold fall. She still wasn't certain the lake was solid, but she was so close to warmth. She could almost feel fire crackling at her side, and her toes feeling once more. There hadn't been a road to the chateau, only into the great lake circling it. The mere idea to have to trek around the entire chateau, to double-check, was enough to make her body tremble. She couldn't manage that. It wasn't possible for her to continue on much longer. If she risked walking around the chateau, then she would find herself face down in a snowbank, and that would be the end of her. She placed her other foot on the ice and tried to disperse her weight. Amisha had once seen a man fall through a pond in Little Marsh. He'd been playing with his friends, jokingly trying to run across the not quite frozen water. The man had fallen 4 steps away from the land, but it was still too far for him to find his way back easily. He laid across the fire and crawled his way back. Once he pulled himself out of the frigid water. Of course, the pond had been much smaller than the lake she now struggled to cross. If she fell through in the middle of the lake, then she wasn't getting back out. Her skirts weighed enough to drag her to the bottom. Amisha shifted the torch, lowering, staring down at the ice to guess its thickness. White bubbles had lifted and frozen in place, giving the entire lake a spotted texture. She wasn't sure why the snow wasn't sticking to the surface. The white flakes blew across the ice until it resembled a mirror. Every step felt as though it would be her last. Every time she moved, the lake seemed to as well. Amisha paused. Each time exhaled, long and slow, she continued forward. It might have been hours to cross the lake, or only a few moments. However long it took, she found herself with her feet touching hand. The muscles in her legs loosened in relief, sending her down onto one knee for a moment. She pressed her fist into the cold ground. Would she ever catch her breath again? She heaved gulp after gulp of frigid air until her lungs ached. You made it, she thought. Now get back on your feet and continue. She shoved herself to standing and shuffled forward. This close to the chateau appeared even longer and larger. It loomed over her like the peak of a mountain, dark and ominous. From across the lake, it had seemed only a forgotten lord with a handful of servants might inhabit such a place. Now, staring up at the broken windows, at aging pillars, Amisha wasn't so certain there would be anyone within the walls at all. Perhaps the dread had already done their work here. Some inner voice whispered she was a danger. She was in danger. And she hesitated. Shards of broken glass littered the ground, not ice. Vines and branches poked through windows, or plants were growing within the walls. Not one had been in the chateau for years, it appeared. This place had long been abandoned. The question was why? Who would leave such an opulent home and to rot? Or had they? A bitter wind blasted through her clothing, sending goosebumps across her flesh. But this time, she didn't feel the cold, not at all. Instead, all she felt was a numbness that frigid her more than the dread. There was no choice. She had to go inside this forgotten chateau. Amisha circled the building, looking for side entrance that servants might have used, that seemed far safer than waltzing in through the front door. Although it looked abandoned, she didn't know what the creature had made this place their home. A small door on the side of the building had been left open, perhaps in their attempt to escape. Amisha imagined the dread attacking a building like this, how they have destroyed the windows, torn from the beautiful artwork within. The walls of this place, they would have turned something so lovely and beautiful into nothing more than rubble. She placed a hand on the open door. 3 deep groves neared and mahogany wood, nearly from the top of the bottom. Her fingers didn't even reach between the expense. Whatever had made such a mark was a great beast indeed. Her stomach twisted, and she should go. She should leave this haunted place, but there was nowhere else to go. Strange, she muttered to herself. What would father say? Be strong, because there is no one else to be strong for you. Repeating the words and hearing them in her own voice Not her father only made her remember just how alone she was. Tears pricked her eyes, but she dashed them away. She had little time for emotions like this. First, she needed to find herself a safe place to rest her head. Holding the torch higher, she stepped into the abandoned chateau. This was the servants' quarters, and the door led into the largest kitchen she had ever seen in her life. Although it had been a hollow shell for many years, the blackened remained of food littered a large table that could have seated 20 people in the center of the room. One wall was lined with so many stoves, she couldn't imagine how much they might have cooked at once. The other wall was lined with pots and pans, each with a thick layer of grime. Despite the clear neglect, the aged place was still beautiful. The table and the gilded legs might have shone if she was polished well enough. Each stove was carved with a story, although she was too tired to figure out what they were. A fairy tale, perhaps. She couldn't hazard a guess. None of the depictions were familiar. The kitchens were a fine place to sleep for the night. She could even check to see if there was charcoal or wood left in the stoves, but she wanted to know what the chateau was, if the floors of the kitchen were made of this finest marble. What did the rest look like? Curiosity sang into her ears like the ringing of bells. Her father used to tell her stories about chateaux such as this place. He'd claim they were a haven for tinkers, secret doors, hidden switches, passages that led all throughout the castle, so servants would never be seen by nobility. She wondered if any such secrets were hidden. Within these walls, she made her way through the kitchen, then pressed a hand against the door, leading out. Her own curiosity was getting the better of her, but she still closed the hand on the doorknob. Anyone could live in this chateau. Even the dread might have taken it over, although she couldn't imagine the creatures living in such a beautiful place. Amisha turned the doorknob and opened the door. She stepped out of the servants' quarters and into a long hallway that took her breath away. The ceiling was hand-painted with scenes of knights on noble steeds, their hunting dogs racing away ahead of them after a white hart. Each painting was more detailed than the last stretch, so far down the hallway that she couldn't even see the end of the murals. Chandeliers larger than she was tall hung from the ceiling. Delicate pieces of glass shifted in the wind, coming through the broken windows, creating a clinking music that danced under the halls on the walls. Golden braziers hung just above the white marble statues of the most beautiful people she'd ever seen in her life. The closet was a woman wrapped in a robe, one breast bare. Her face looked as though she had been frozen in a moment of time, for no artist could carve a face that perfect. Holding up her torch, Amisha stepped down the hall, her boots crushed. Broken glass shards everywhere. She went, but she ignored the danger. Instead, she allowed her eyes to feast on sights before her. She couldn't get enough. Drunk on the artwork, the beauty, and the splendor she would likely never see again in her lifetime. What family had lived here? Were the statues a likeness of the people who had called this place their home? Surely not. No, one was so handsome in real life. Amisha stopped in front of a knight. His armor had been carved with such detail. She could see the scratch marks from battles long before. Staring up into his cold and vacant eyes, she lifted the torch higher just so she could see more of the detail. "Who are you?" she whispered. The carved figure was so lifelike. She wouldn't have sworn the marble eyes turned to look at her, and his lips pursed as though he would answer her. Something shattered down the hall, glass or perhaps some kind of pottery against the floor. Amisha ducked into the small alcove behind the knight. What was it her father always did? Where there is one dread, there are many. As in a slow motion, the back of the knight shifted. A large slab of marble had propped it against the wall, holding it up for all eternity. But when she moved behind, the statue shifted. Amisha put her back against the stone and wedged her feet against the wall. Another shard cracked. She caught before it hit the ground, but also dropped the torch as well. The fabric at the end hit the floor, while the wooden handle thankfully landed on her foot. All the sounds were muffled. Please don't be loud enough for something to hear, she thought. Amisha remained frozen in the shadows, hidden behind the blocking form of the knight, holding it in place. Her fire flickered and guttered out. Something approached down the hall. She knew the sound all too well, and it made her breath catch in her chest. Strange tapping followed by the slow slithering of a tail. The dread had found her. How? She had been so careful, and none of them had seen her cross the lake, or she would have heard the flapping of their wings. Her footprints wouldn't be left in the snow, not with the wind covering them. She held herself still. The dread was nearly upon her, but this time there was another sound attached to its movement, the sound of something heavy, big drag. Holding her breath, she shifted position and peered around the knight's shoulder. The dread was walking toward her, pulled body behind itself, a man unconscious and limp. The creature held the man's collar and pulled himself down as long hall. It didn't seem inconvenient, despite the additional weight, as she wanted. As she watched, time seemed slow. The dread pulled the mitten past her, and she stared down into the familiar face. Remy, she survived Little Marsh. Perhaps others had too. A bloom of hope grew in her chest. An unkempt beard covered his chin, and Amisha had told him many times to cut it. Remy wasn't old enough to grow a beard, even though he was a man now. He wanted people to think of him as older, so he didn't mind if his beard was patchy. At least he looked like he was trying. The dread stalked down the hall. He did not enter the kitchen as she feared. Instead, it went through a different door. On the left, she hadn't noticed and then disappeared from sight with her townsman tow. Amisha's fingers had yet to find feeling in them. She was cold, tired, and scared. Out of her wits, this place was infested with the dread. It seemed there was nowhere she could hide from them. Her knees shook, and her palms slicked with sweat. She was frozen in place, incapable of moving even the slightest. She was stuck. Where could she go when she had wandered into the den of the beasts? Her father's voice whispered in her ear, "Rational thinking, dear one. Think, a chateau this large must have some kind of cottage nearby where the huntsman might have lived. That would be safer than staying in this building, teeming with the very chateaus who had hunted their people down. A single woman couldn't have anyone from the clutches of hundreds of beasts. They were stronger. It didn't matter. Her gut told her to help. She couldn't save Remy. She shouldn't even try. Else she'd lose her own life." Amisha searched the hall for any of the other dread. No one stepped forward. The only sound was the whistling of the wind. A gust of airbrush snowed onto the marble floors. Through the nearest broken window, carefully, she let the statue lean back against the wall, propped once more. She hoped down from the alcove and took one step toward the window, though the shards of glass made it more dangerous. She couldn't step out onto the grounds and be gone to a monster's notice. From the doors on the left came a shout of fear. "No!" Remy's voice echoed through the hall. "No, please, don't!" She winced under the window and was so close. Her freedom was right there. And there was nothing she could do to stop Remy from whatever fate he now faced. "Don't," she warned herself. "Amisha, don't." But her feet returned to the her own accord, she reached down and pulled off her boots. And though her toes ached with the cold, she was still silent, and each step closer to the door. The dread were just beyond. Amisha pressed her hand against the closed entrance. She could almost feel a panic. No, she could almost feel the panic. In the room beyond, where Remy continued to shout for mercy, wouldn't only be one chance. And if they saw her? She didn't want to think about that. Slowly she eased her shoulder against the door and let it swing open, just enough for her to poke her head through. Arches outlined a long hallway that led to a throne. A second level above the arches made it look like a monastery or perhaps a courtroom where prisoners awaited judgment. Each arch was carved out of marble, white marble. Lilies of the valley and English ivy decorated every inch. The floor was white and black checkered, seeming to draw the eye into the throne. At the end of the hallway, Amisha's eyes found him, the largest dread she had ever seen. The others were much larger than humans, but this one could only be their king. He lounged on the throne, so tall, his crimson wings draped over the back of his tip, folded onto the floor. His legs were as large as the tree trunks. His tail coiled around an ankle and tipped with a wicked barb. The other dread were gray-skinned, but his skin was like charcoal. Twin horns rose from his head, larger than life, and twisted back toward the skull. Matted dark hair hung between the horns and rested atop of his arms, his hair nearly longer than hers. She'd seen nothing like him before. The dread dragged Remy to the throne, where it tossed him like a child dropping a doll. Remy turned onto hands and knees, begging the large dread to release him. "Please," he whimpered. His words echoed in the hall. "I am but a poor servant. I've done nothing. I beg you for mercy." She had never heard the dread speak, and this creature was no different. When he lifted a hand, the sound of 100 wings beat through the air. Amisha looked up. At the second level arches, twin walls of the dread stepped forward to stare down at Remy. There were more than she could count, all standing in attention, their wings folded back, their gray faces grim. There was no mercy here. And there was no way for her to save Remy, not with so many of the dread who would kill her on sight. Her fingers clenched on the door. She stared at the largest of the dread, who had his hand raised. Slowly his finger curled into his palm, his thumb remaining up. Then he tilted his hand down until the clawed thumb pointed at the ground. "What does that mean?" Remy asked, his voice frantic. "What does that mean?" The dread behind him stepped forward, lifted a clawed hand, and brought it down upon Remy's back. 3 ragged tears sliced through Remy's shirt. 3 bloody lines appeared, blood oozing from them and dripping down his back. He let out a scream that made the hairs on his arms arise. It wasn't the screams of a man, but a monster. His voice warped from the warm toes she had known into something howling with rage. Even from her distance, she could see his body changing, his spine arched, bone appearing that shouldn't be there. Something moved underneath the skin of his back. Snakes underneath the long columns of back muscles withering with every movement. Then 2 wings split open the skin of his back. They flared out of his body. Even as he leaned forward, dug his now clawed hands at the floor. Tears slid down her cheeks. As she pressed a hand to her mouth, she silenced her own cries. A howling rage his voice filled the air, but that was no longer Remy. Her father had been right. They weren't trying to kill her people. They were building an army, and all they needed was to bring everyone back to the chateau, turn them into slathering beasts like the rest of them. Amisha stepped away from the door, unable to watch what happened next. She couldn't bear to see him as anything other than the miller's boy who used to throw apples at her when she got too close to him. Why hadn't she thought she could save him? She was just the tinkering's daughter, who had gone too close to the monsters underneath the bed. She grabbed onto her skirt, and still the shaking of her hands. The huntsman's cottage was her only chance at the small bit of safety. They wouldn't search there, not right under their noses. They couldn't. In her haste to leave, Amisha didn't notice the stand with the candlestick beside it. Her hip caught the table at the right angle to rattle the candlestick. She snagged it, stilling the sound. All fell silent. She wouldn't have heard a hairpin drop to the floor, and that was somehow worse than the howls of pain from Remy, who had also paused to listen. A voice in her head whispered, "Run!" Amisha bolted toward the kitchen, even as the first call resounded from within the strange room beyond. The braying of hunting hounds chased her down the hall. All right, so that was Chapter 4 of Book 1, Gilded Rose by Emma Ham. I hope you enjoyed it, and I cannot wait to get into Chapter 5, which will be the last chapter preview before I get into Book 2 and 3. But like I said, I'm so sorry about the long wait. But like I said, when you're busy with all kinds of things, you just lose track of time. Remember to subscribe to my YouTube page. Remember to like my Facebook page. And remember to listen to me on Spotify or Anchor.fm. Bye!
Are you looking for adventure or something funny to make you laugh? Maybe a mystery or a drama, some of this and some of that. A library is like a big buffet. Try something different.